Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting live from our Sanctum Sanctorum in Venice, California. This is the Sixth Sense Society. I'm your host, Krista, here with our producer, Michael, and today we're excited to have back on the show Merle Yost, who is an expert on relationship. For those of you who have not seen his previous shows, he is an author, consultant, speaker, and psychotherapist with decades of experience. So we're very excited to have him on the show today to talk about how to choose healthy relationships. And before we get started, Michael has a few announcements.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our show again. We have some really great stuff coming up. Next week, we have Karen Frasca coming back, and she's going to help us celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And we're going to be talking about some Irish mythology, so that'll be a lot of fun. The following week, we have Lama Kathy Wesley back by popular demand, and we will be looking at the dualistic mind, and a very important concept in Buddhism. And then we're going to end the month with our good friend Jacqueline Delibes, and she's going to be talking about the importance of humor when it comes to spirituality and consciousness. So, and I do think that there are many spiritual paths that maybe perhaps have lost their sense of humor a little too much, but we'll talk about that with her. And so all kinds of great stuff planning ahead. We're have guests now booked up all the way to the summer, so stick with us, and we've got a lot of great content coming up. You can get all the information on our website, sixthsensesociety.com, SIXTH, all spelled out. And while you're there, if you can afford to, leave us a coffee on Ko-Fi, and that helps us cover a bit of our production cost, and we definitely appreciate that. And if you can't afford it, stay tuned, and we love doing this for you guys. So we appreciate every fan that we have. And then you can also sign up to our newsletter and so forth. So just check our website for that. And if you happen to be on the go and you want to listen to us in audio podcast, just check out Sixth Sense Society, search for us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and we are easy to find. So with that, I'm going to kick you back over to Krista, and take it away, Krista.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And welcome, Merle.
Thank you for having me very much. Great to be back.
Oh, we're always happy to have you. We've had very good response to the other shows, and it's always very interesting to hear your thoughts about these topics about relationship and healing. But let's get started. I realized thinking about the show, what a huge topic we are tackling. So obviously you can speak many, many hours on this topic, and you have a unique experience of having not only worked on yourself, but sat with so many different people and seen the insides of it, so to speak, and thought about it and written about it. So let's get started about what you would consider even some of the aspects of a healthy relationship.
Well, yeah, this is a massive topic. If I could reframe that slightly.
Sure.
I think that the most fundamental thing is, I guess the frame I wanted to talk about today is from picking a partner. If you're going to look for a long-term relationship with someone or a permanent one, what's the foundation of that? And I think that the most important choice that we ever make as human beings is who we're going to breed with, much more so than who we partner with, because those aren't always the same thing, as we well know. But coming back to the partner part, is that we usually jump in before we know someone. And we don't take the time to really fundamentally find out who this other person is and reveal who we are to them. And granted, that's a lifetime process, but it takes a couple of years to actually get to know someone, and being around them a lot and seeing them at their best and at their worst and their in between, and to see these different aspects and part of them. And we want to fall in love and all that glorious limerence and that excitement in the beginning and all that sexual rush. And we sort of gloss over the red flags that are screaming at us until we're married and have kids and a long-term relationship and other people involved. And then it's much more messy. to deal with and try and clean up. So if I would say that there's one thing that's more important than any other, it is take the time to get to know someone. And I recently wrote an article called Making Better Choices When Dating. But the fundamental thesis of it is to wait 3 months to have sex with someone. Because in that, if you start having sex right off the bat, which can be nice, but you then get lost in all that new rush of excitement and the pheromones and the sexual rush and the glow of all of that. And again, you're glossing over what's going on. And that getting along in that level is substituted for knowing who this person is and really getting along with them. As we know, that glow tends to fade. And if you're in a long-term relationship, it's a different kind of sexuality that takes over. But we want to believe that limerence, that beginning infatuation that we have is going to last forever.
So basically, it's advice to have a courtship.
Yes. But because in today's world, our hookup world, we tend to have sex first and ask questions later. Mm-hmm. And if you're just out playing around and experimenting, that's okay. But if you actually are wanting to know if this person can be there for the long haul, it doesn't make sense because it's about intimacy. And if you rush into sex, you're then bypassing the process of deepening the intimacy. And I use the example in the article. If you sit on an airplane with somebody, you've probably had somebody tell their life story to you and tell you things they probably never tell anybody else. Well, that's a kind of faux intimacy because they're not really taking any real risk because they're never going to see you again. They're never going to talk to you. You don't know anybody in their life. There's no real risk there. They're just dumping their crap on you. So, and if you jump in bed with someone immediately or too soon, it's again a kind of faux intimacy because you're forcing this kind of vulnerability and neither one of you are going to get truly vulnerable with the other person. Vulnerability is the act of revealing who you are to the other person. That's intimacy. And so then we do that in layers, and we do that and we just peel back one layer after another after another. And sexual intimacy, really good sexual intimacy, requires that you spend a lot of time really talking to the other person about what sex means to them and how sex looks to them. And I use the example in the article of when you drop into bed with somebody without these kind of conversations, it's like throwing a Hail Mary pass in a football game. You're throwing a pass, you're hoping there's somebody on the other end to catch it because you don't know. You don't know if you both like the same things. You don't know that you want to do the same things. You don't know that you enjoy the same kind of activities. And there's a huge range, as we know, in sexuality. And if really good sex comes out of taking the time to communicate that before you jump into bed so that you have a roadmap of what's going to happen before you get there. Not you're going to detail this and this and this, but you know what they like or what they don't like. And it's sort of guessing and waiting to see if this is landing or not. It takes you out of the moment and takes you out of the experience. And that's such a metaphor for all the other ways that we have to get to know each other around money and relationship and parenting and being social and quiet intimacy time. In my fourth book, When Love Lasts Forever, one of the authors wrote, or contributors, was an anthology, said that being in a long-term relationship is mastering the art of being alone together.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
And if you can't do that, then it's not going to be a successful relationship. So there's just all these little things that add up to that. But I guess the crux of what I wanted to talk about today is take the time to get to know them. And that's where long distance relationships are so difficult. Mm-hmm. You're only going to get to know somebody so well on Skype or Zoom or whatever platform you're using, or you have to wake up in the morning. You have to hear them snore at night. You have to see what they look like and how they act after a long day at work. And you only did that by being in close proximity with them for a long time.
So what do you think about the concept? I read this, and I've thought about it before this, in Mastery. Robert Greene talks about social intelligence in that really great book. And one of the things he points out, which I find is very true, is that if you watch people neutrally, they reveal themselves, but a lot of times we don't believe what we see or we discount it. And he talks about how by just accepting what you see is already liberating. And how do you teach people to do it? Because sometimes they'll sort of go around the bush about it, and then they'll still don't want to look at it, even though it is what you would call a red flag. So how do you help people to then really accept what they see about the person as they get to know them?
Well, I think it was Maya Angelou who said, Angelo Low, I don't remember which it is.
Angelo, yep.
Said that people tell you who they are, believe them. And I find that's profoundly true. I mean, I cheat because I have all this skill set that I've worked centuries to develop. But most people haven't examined themselves well enough to understand what they're seeing in others. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but you have to be self-aware in order to recognize what you're seeing in another person. And you also have to want to see it. And so many of us live in the fantasy of our families. We grow up in a family that teaches us this dance of intimacy and this way of being in the world. And then we take that style because we think that's how the world works out into the world. And that's the lens of perception that we're seeing the whole world. So, and since we often marry our parents in one form or another, when we find that dance, you think, oh, I finally found the person that's going to love me because this is the style I'm used to having it. And just because it was abusive or humiliating or whatever, or it wasn't really that good. And then we find that out in the long run. But we're caught in our own delusions of what the world is and isn't. And we don't see other people and we don't see what's actually going on. That takes a real commitment to getting outside of our own frame of reference.
Well, I mean, obviously, the romantic projection is one of the most powerful culturally and is supported culturally until one discovers it's an addiction. And hopefully some of us do. So if we know, let's say we go in and we're somewhat wounded, but we're a little more aware. Let's say we know we really do want the real thing, even though we're not quite sure. And we're on our way on that path, perhaps in a more healthy way than we used to be. What would you say were some of the things we ought to look for in getting to know someone that means the person really is a legitimate possibility for a partner? Are there some traits or some signs of this is a good idea that you have noticed when talking to people?
I don't know that I have a list off the top of my head, but let me just chew on that for a second. I think the most obvious is, do you feel heard? When you talk, do you feel like they're really paying attention? Are they really interested? Are they really hearing what you're saying as opposed, or do they feedback what they think you're saying or tell you some cliche thing and gloss over? That's a huge red flag. And another is, how do they handle money? I mean, sex and money are the two things that blow up relationships more often than anything else. So it's really important to have an understanding of how each of you think about money. And more relationships now, they never combine money, which I think is really interesting, because to me, that says that there's a level of not trusting this other person. And I think that's not a foundation to be in a long-term relationship. But that's how I look at it. They may not, they're obviously okay with that. I know a couple who've been married for 40 years that have never combined money. And I just think that's really interesting. That you can share a child and you can share all these other things, but you can't share your money. I think that's just a fascinating look into relationship. But how they the number one thing that we tell people to do is look at their relationship. If you're a woman in relationship with a man, what's his relationship like with his mother? If you're a man in relationship with a woman, what's her relationship like with her father? Because we learn how to be in relationship with that gender from that gender of the parent. So that's a massive, massive clue as to how things are going to go.
I definitely agree with that. And again, it's not like we have to have a perfect relationship with these parents, but also I think just being aware for me, particularly when I was younger, I was aware of my relationship with my father, and I worked on it many, many, many years to the point we get along great now. And that was a big surprise for me that that happened and in this lifetime. But he's worked on himself in his many, many years too. And I was, you still can, in my case, I still picked poorly, but I was still in the midst of figuring it all. The wounds can take a while. I mean, I think we have to be patient with ourselves too, because it's a huge thing when you have a parental wound of some kind.
Well, it's so important to work on healing it. And so many people just never do. And that's really the problem. And then they go into these relationships expecting everything to be wonderful or to heal magically that wound with their parents because we think this is going to solve all your problems, and all you're doing is just bringing them into your relationship. And my ex and I married my father. He married his father. And my sage advice is to marry a healthier version.
Right, because they can have traits that are good too.
Right, exactly. And plus, it gives you a foundation to actually interact, that you both have to continue working on healing and evolving. And if one does and the other doesn't, then that's going to end the relationship.
So I agree with you with the money and the sex being often the big issues, because obviously we hear that through the tarot readings. But are there other maybe common interests that aren't as well known that you have found dealing with in therapy with people?
Say that again.
Are there any other common sort of problems or issues that, other than the sex and money often being, if you're not in agreement or have issues there, that you have found that maybe do affect people in terms of long-lasting happiness and partnership?
Well, parenting, that's massive, 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 massive. And of relationships with the extended family. And the importance of that and what role they're going to play in your life, and in-laws, and how much give some people never grow up and their in-laws still, or their parents still run their life. And that's huge. Another one is religion. And particularly if you have kids, how are you going to raise the kids in terms of religion or spirituality? And if one does and one doesn't, then how do you reconcile your values? Because values are really, really, really important in terms of a long-term relationship that you, and some of it goes back to money. Is it all about experiences now, or is it about saving for the future? Or is buying a home more important than taking a great vacation or having a massive wedding? And so all of these things extrapolate into the longer picture. And we think that because we think this, that they think that too, because we're merged into this one glom initially. And that merging is actually another big red flag. Can you stay separate enough to see the other person and also have empathy and compassion for them without absorbing their stuff? And in a more intimate relationship, that's really hard to really learn how not to do, because we're so programmed that merging is love.
Right. Michael, you have a question?
Yeah, just based on some of the chat that we have going on, maybe to ask Merle again, one of the things we see a lot are people with relationships that maybe read too many romance novels and just have an incredibly unhealthy relationship of what a real or expectation of a real relationship. So they're looking for some absolutely perfect relationship where every day is absolutely perfect. So can you maybe touch on how to manage expectations in a relationship?
Well, it's secondary to how grounded this person is in the world. What you're describing is somebody who's living in a fantasy about what the world is like. And there's no amount of expectations that's going to change that if they aren't willing, if they grew up in a world that either didn't validate reality or they lived in a fantasy land because it was so awful. And so what you're describing is somebody who's really wounded. And so there's not much you can do about that as a consequence if they aren't willing to heal themselves and work on themselves. And a lot of people just aren't. I get into this argument with therapists sometimes is that I'm a huge believer in integrating the child parts. Because otherwise you have these child parts jumping out and taking over and doing strange things at strange times. And in a relationship, that can be quite lethal. So it's really important to be as adult as you can be, and both of you. But what you're describing is just somebody who's really delusional or lost in illusion maybe from a little bit to a lot, that can be really detrimental to being in a relationship, and they have to want to come out of it. And I often joke that when people come into my office and tell me they had an ideal childhood and that was fabulous, and I know it's going to be long-term therapy, because we have to get through the illusions and their denial about what happened so we can actually heal what did occur.
So what do you mean exactly by integrating the child part?
Well, anytime that we've had a traumatic experience that doesn't heal, we build a wall around that experience, and that child part of us is split off that had that experience. And so anytime we get reminded of that experience, that child part can pop back out and take charge, because they're the ones who figured out how to survive it in the first place. Not heal it, but survive it. In my workshop, I use the example, because I've seen this so many times, of the parent dropping off the 5-year-old or 6-year-old child to the library for story hour, and they're supposed to pick them up in an hour and come back, and the parent fails to show up. Well, a child that age is normally and healthily narcissistic, and so it's all about them. So the parent not being there, the child is abandoned, and they blame themselves. It's their fault that the parent did not show up. They did something wrong. They didn't make the parent happy. And so that becomes this wound. And anytime they feel abandoned in the rest of their life, if they haven't healed that, they go back to being that 6-year-old all over again and blaming themselves.
Ah, interesting. Makes sense.
So that's why we have to go back and get those lost parts that are stuck, because otherwise we find ourselves regressing all the time. I talk about, because sexual abuse is my specialty, is that anytime you're sexually abused at any age, you're psychosexually stuck at that age. So if you're a 3-year-old and you're sexually abused, you're a 3-year-old until you work through that abuse whenever you have sex. If you're a 15-year-old and you get raped or assaulted, or something bad happens around your sexuality, you're stuck at that age until such time as you resolve that, psychosexually speaking. And so we do this in different things. And so it's just, we don't really respect how difficult growing up is. We idealize childhood as this wonderful, carefree experience. And it's not, because we pop out, we don't know anything, and we're supposed to make sense out of all of this. Why is this person chopping on me? Why is this person poking me? And why is this person rubbing me and doing all these things? And all these bright lights, we're in this nice, warm, cozy environment, and all of a sudden we're thrust out into the world, and we're supposed to make sense out of it. And that's our job. But that's really pretty traumatic.
Yes.
I just wanted to jump in quickly, just to apologize to our viewers. We're having a bit of a technical issue, so we've kind of lost Merle's video, but we have his audio. So I'm sorry, Merle. Joys of doing live TV. But we will keep our focus on your audio and keep going. So persevere.
Great, thank you.
Well, yeah, and I certainly never had an ideal view of my childhood, I have to admit. But even so, it's interesting to me when you talk about what hurts a child at different ages. I think sometimes it can be overlooked by us as an adult because we have a different perspective, like you were saying, to a 5-year-old compared to a 12-year-old, and that idea of the soul loss. And I think that's probably another reason why healing is so complex. There's like the obvious damages, and then these others that are equally damaging, but we don't really see it that way as adults, and we sort of bypass it. Well, that was, that wasn't a big deal, dismissing it, and yet it's there, like you said, ready to pop out. And do you think there are, having worked with people over a long period of time, do you find that there are points in which, let's say someone had a very, very difficult time as a person, and they were healing, but they were not completely healed? When is a good time for them to, really delve into relationship again? Because I know that I've talked to some therapists where they'll even say, hey, for a year, you should probably just not even think about dating. Or is it something you just kind of play by ear? What is your experience with that?
Well, there's no set rule, because each person's individual in their own trauma. And if somebody's so severely traumatized that they're really not functional in terms of relationship, I might say, you need to do some work on yourself before you put yourself out there, because you keep setting yourself up to get more and more wounded, and that's not useful in this process. There's enough wounding there for us already for us to deal with. We don't need to add layers onto that. But if there's some specific wounding as opposed to just a broad, horrific childhood, it might be okay. And it's also, there's a difference between being okay to be sexual, assuming sexuality is not the trauma. As I say, I'm not against hookups. I just don't try and take them seriously in terms of relationship because they're experimentation. They're figuring out who you are. I think they're an important part of your 20s, even teens. We tend to frown on people having sex, but the truth is that's how we learn about what we like and what we don't like. And we put all this religious and moral stuff on it instead of just understanding this is part of functioning as an adult and becoming a functioning adult. I mean, I see all these religions that want you to stay celibate until marriage, like, and then you get in a relationship with somebody and both of you are allegedly virgins. Neither of you have any idea what's going on. This is the wrong time to figure it out. One is, and two, you might find out the two of you have completely different sexual taste or interest, and you're married to this person, but you didn't know that because you've never had the experiences of being in this. So I do think that there's no one right. I mean, if somebody's really, really wounded by dating, then I would tell them to stop dating. If that's not a big trauma in their life, but they still need to work on the relationship with their family, that's fine. I just tell them to not be too serious about it this moment, that have some fun and get to know people. You never know when when it'll happen, the right person shows up. That may give them more incentive to do deeper work quicker. So most of the time people come into therapy because of relationship stuff in one form or another. Because it's I call families the Therapist Full Employment Act. So
well, you've mentioned it, of course, several times during the show. We're talking about compatibility with sexuality, but also about how to communicate. And one of the things I found in my evolution was being able to speak up and say what I liked and what I didn't. And it's definitely, at least as a woman, I don't know, maybe I just felt you weren't supposed to do that somehow, the man would know magically, what I liked or not by my response. And then some people see it, I think, maybe as unromantic, but I think that personally, I do feel it's more satisfying. But so how do you help people to learn to communicate if they're nervous about it or they just don't even know how to approach it? Do you have tools or techniques that you use to help people open up so that they can do that?
There's a really good book called Your Brain on Sex that I often recommend that really goes into how you became the sexual being that you are and gives you some strategies for having these conversations, which is very helpful. But the task is that you don't just come in on the first date and reveal your entire sexual history and say, I want this, 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 and this, and this. And people do that. It's too much too soon. And it's all about you. It's not about them. Sexual communication is a dialogue. It's not a monologue. And so you really have to put this out there and say, I think this is that layers of vulnerability is that we start with this layer and then as we get to know them better, we go deeper and deeper to this stuff. And the reason that is that we have so intertwined sex and shame in particularly American culture and certainly some other cultures as well. And so the more you get revealing about who you are, the deeper levels of shame. And most people really aren't ready to risk that kind of vulnerability and shouldn't, because a rejection can be devastating and set them way back. So the more shame you have, the more difficult it's going to be to talk about. But so some of that's just educating yourself about what really sexuality is and what it isn't, because we have so many overlays in our culture from family and religion and all this other stuff, like an STD. It's the scarlet letter. I can't tell you how many profiles I see that say I'm STD free. Virtually no one is STD free. Both types of herpes are virtually ubiquitous. HPV is ubiquitous. And so consequently, anybody who tells you that they're STD free and they're looking for the same is telling you they're ashamed of sex. Because if they get an STD, it's that the world is all over, as opposed to they got a virus. You get viruses all the time. And most people have herpes 1, while they're in childhood, because mom passes it on because she had it on her lips and she kisses the kid on the lips and he gets it from mom. And so it's just silly. And so
Yeah, that is really a very good point, actually. And I remember I was very lucky. I had a friend in my early 20s who's we were good friends, and she had an STD, and she was very open and very intelligent about it. She talked to people about it, her close friends, of course, her lovers, and I was very impressed by, and it really impressed me as someone that was trying to really work with it in a very conscious way, and had worked out any issues around it. And it was really good to meet someone like that, actually. And
Unusual.
yeah, when
'Cause
I think about it, it really was unusual. I was just impressed by how well she dealt with it, with communication and everything. And so you're right, but that's an interesting view about the STDs. I like that about, so many people have it, and I guess people don't even know that.
They don't. They're in oblivion. And I've worked this. I have a specialty in people with herpes, and I've had a lot of these clients, and some of them just could never get past the shame of having a sexually transmitted disease. We have the same problem with HIV. We have the same problem with so many things, but herpes is the one that's so ubiquitous. And there are these huge clubs, and it's just the walk of shame to deal with this. Instead of, they see it as the scarlet letter. They cannot get past the fact that they were sexually active. But in so much of religion, I was thinking about this the other day, is that sex is to be punished for. And that the reason you can't get an abortion if you had a sex out of wedlock is that it's your punishment for having sex. So we're making having a child punishment. But it's kind of the whole religious culture around shaming people around their sexuality. And unfortunately, it's really, really common. We blame the victim when people are sexually abused. And so it's boys in particular. Boys are told that they were lucky or they shouldn't complain. And particularly if it was a girl, they're told that any contact between a boy and a female of any age, he's lucky. As opposed to a victim. And I can tell you he's as damaged as any other person. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of the sexual compulsivity you see in around porn and sexual acting out and so forth. So as a society, we're not willing to face our problems. We aren't willing to name them and start to heal them, because that requires us to take a look at ourselves. And we would rather point our fingers at other people and say they're bad than look at the pain inside.
It's true. And what I think about, at least some of Western civilization, is that we have this weird prudishness around sexuality. I mean, because even in some of my European clients, it's just talked about differently. And that, I think, comes from that whole religious overlay that we're all sort of susceptible to, because we live in this country. It's like osmosis or something. And how can we get beyond that sort of prudishness too, like you were saying, the shame, and to me, sexuality, it's part of being human. It's and there's many ways to express it. It's sort of like, to me, I look at sex as like different kinds of meals. Like you have really extravagant banquets, and then sometimes you just have like a hot dog, and I mean
I love that.
And well, after a while, I think as a young woman, I got a little tired of it being one way or the other, either like nothing about sex or always about sex. And I was just sort of like, can't we just have it as part of our life? That's a wonderful, beautiful part, but it isn't, I don't have to have one extreme over the other. And that even in witchcraft, there's an overemphasis on the young witch and the sexuality, and I am a powerful woman if I show my body, and after a while I was just sort of tired of that, like, can I just be a person?
Yeah, really. Well, we have to first own that when the white people really came to this continent, that it was founded by Puritans. And we are still plagued by that Puritan overlay of our culture, sexually speaking. And we have to own that, acknowledge it, and repudiate it so that we can actually move beyond it. That we have to own that. We seem to have pride that these people were escaping oppression and coming here. Well, they sound pretty oppressive to me themselves. And we haven't really owned that piece of it. But it is so deep in our culture, and we have such a resistance to looking at sex, and we sexualize children and then we pathologize older adults, and it just gets really weird. And actually, I'd much rather have an adult with a 40, 50, 60-year-old than I would with a 20 or 30-year-old, because they have some better sense, hopefully, of what's going on inside of them and what they like and what they don't like. And unfortunately, that's not really valued. It's about what the other person looks like is where the greatest value is.
Yeah.
And we adore youth.
And it is interesting when they've done studies on people. I forget some of the famous sexual studies, but I remember reading about some at one point where people that were really happy with their sexuality, it had nothing to do really with how they looked. And we all have had friends that are gorgeous, and they feel that they tell you they have a terrible sex life, you know. So there is proof that it's fine to be attractive, but it doesn't guarantee good sex.
Well, because too many people are having sex with a body instead of a person. Oh, that's a gorgeous body. I can't wait to touch that body. But they don't really have any idea who the person is, and you're being objectified. How could there be any pleasure in that? I mean, that's just sad.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have my body. I'll pick it up when you're done. I mean,
that's a perfect way to put it. You're right.
So there's a real curse almost of being attractive because people don't see you.
Right. They just see what your body is and how you exactly. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about too was obviously, you know, people want to be in love and love the other person, and that's a big word. One of the words that I think gets left out of the talk is respect. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about respect and respecting one another. And why don't we talk about that as much as say trust and love, and when it comes to relationships?
Oh, it's a loaded word is why. I mean, I agree with you completely. I think if you respect a person, you can have good sex with them. If you respect a person, you can negotiate finances. You can do all of this, and that they respect you. But if you go into a relationship not respecting somebody, it's going to fail, or it'll be a nightmare of a relationship. And I think that is a real fundamental thing that we don't talk about enough, is how important that is that you can deal with a lot of differences if you respect the other person and how they got there,
right,
and why they're there. But if you don't respect them, then you're just going to look down on them and think they're stupid. And wrong,
yes.
But mostly stupid. And that's not good for sex or relationship. It leads to condescension and patronization and reductionism, and to the point that you're not in a relationship with this person. You've turned them into a child or a lesser than, or they've done that to you, and there's no meeting. I mean, the number one, I largely stopped doing couples counseling. Some people absolutely adore it. I'm not one of them. And the reason is that all too often I have somebody who is developmentally speaking, their psychosexual emotional development was of a 3-year-old, and the other one was like a 12-year-old. And they were trying to be in a relationship, and guess what? They couldn't communicate. There was no meeting ground for them. Mm-hmm. And so I'd spend my time trying to get them to grow up and work with them so that they might find somewhere in the middle that they could actually connect. And I just got really, really tired of that dynamic, because too many children running around adult bodies, and people don't know it because they're a child running around an adult body too.
Well, what would you say is one of the first indications that someone has really started to grow up when you're going through therapy and you're working on yourself? Are there some things that you personally can observe about yourself as a person healing that would be, you know, indicative that you're actually doing the work?
Yeah, they have greater compassion, greater empathy. They can see the other perspective and respect it. And those are often the primary things that are missing in a relationship. It's like they can't really appreciate where the other person is or what's going on for them. And of course, our society, we think we're supposed to feel their feelings for them, which is absolutely insane. But as I preach, if I can use that word, that it's about being a profound witness of the other person's pain. But that means you have to get out of your pain to just observe theirs and not take it on, because we all want to be seen by somebody else. I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about that, is that when we're in our greatest pain, We want someone nearby who loves us, who sees us, not feels it for us, but is there holding the space for us to have our pain and witness it. And that's really, and if they can do that, you can probably work through just about anything.
I love that. It's so true. I remember, I think it was in Women Who Run with the Wolves, it was one of her works, Clarissa Mikolaiestis talks about what eros is. And eros is this where you really stop and really see the person in that moment, even if you've known them, and especially if you've known them for 10 years, and that you have that intimacy in that moment when you really say, oh, I see, my partner really looks really down more than normally, and I see it, I witness it, and I take it in, and it creates that energy that people feel. And so I think one of the things about relationship for me is that feminine aspect that is all about space and energy that is very hard to pin down, but when you go through it, you know it. You've had that moment with somebody.
Yeah, I agree. But we don't value contact. We don't value intimacy. Most people don't even know what it really is, because we're not taught. We're just assumed that everybody knows what intimacy is or vulnerability is. And we have a really poor track record of educating people about this stuff. Most people think intimacy is sex. There's plenty of sex out there that has no intimacy at all.
Yes.
It's not a requirement to have sex. If you want to have good sex, I think it's a pretty good requirement. But there's plenty of people who are just looking for it to use another person as an object to get off on or get off to, but not have any real contact with them outside of that pretty container that they're projecting whatever they want to be on it. We make people into who we want them to be, and then are shocked and horrified to find out who they really are. Mm-hmm. There's an old quote, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but there's this, that a woman marries a man to make him to make him the man she wants him to be, and then she divorces him because he's not the man she married. There's some truth in that.
I my teacher, Buddhist teacher, Khenpo Rinpoche, now he was a celibate monk, and he gave me some of the best relationship advice, which I don't know how he was so good at it, but I remember he knew me pretty well, I have to admit. I was very open with him, and I remember asking him about it, and he told me not to be so impetuous and to be more practical. And I wasn't at the time. And then he said it takes many, many years to really learn to love each other and to love one another. And I was in my 20s, and it was a really good thing for me to hear. All of that was absolutely what I needed to hear. And I actually started trying to take his advice. I slowed it down, and I still made mistakes, but it really stuck with me. And he gave other really sensible advice about other kinds of relationships too, with older people. And it just goes to show someone that has worked on themselves and is not even in that kind. He's obviously having relationships, but he understands the dynamics of relationship and what it really means to care about somebody, which I think, at least from my point of view, I often think people think that, sure, that there's this element of sexuality that gives it a different layer, but there are some basic ideas that apply to all relationships. And I think people don't realize that.
Well, and the better we get to know ourselves, the better we get to know the other person, and the more we're able to see them and love them and feel loved by them. I mean, one of my big complaints is this whole fantasy about self-love. Mm. I think it's just absolute nonsense. I think it's a bad idea, because I believe love is something you give another person, and it's something you get back from another person. So if you're lathering yourself with all this self-love, you're blocking anybody else getting love to you, because you've created this closed loop. The task for oneself is acceptance.
Yes.
I have a pot belly. I have this. I have that. And so not enough this and too much of that. And so if you can accept that, then there's a better chance that they're going to be able to accept it too.
Absolutely. I mean, we all love being around someone that themselves, they accept themselves, they radiate. It's comfortable, especially as you get older. Who wants to be around narcissists? When you're young, you might not know, but someone that's just themselves and they accept it and they know themselves. And I know that it's unusual, but I've certainly met people like that in my life, and they're not necessarily perfect, but it always touches me. It doesn't matter what they do in their career. It's that you just feel comfortable because they're comfortable.
Yeah, well, they're just taking up their space. They're not taking up yours.
That's a good point too.
What a concept. And so they're really easy to be around because they're not this vampire sucking the blood out of you or your energy or trying to get your validation that they're fabulous. They're just like hanging out and like, oh my God, we can actually just have a good time now. But that's hopefully what happens in a long-term relationship is that you accept them, flaws and all, and this is enough. And I'm okay with this. And I'm getting more than I'm losing. And hopefully that will continue to get better. And we don't really value the joy that can come out of that. And all too often, as people get older and they get to come to terms with themselves, they decide this is not enough. This is not working for me. And I'm unwilling to spend the rest of my life putting up with this. And I think that's okay. But if they'd have taken the time in the beginning to know themselves and know who the other person was, maybe they'd have saved each of them a lot of time and a lot of pain to get to that point. There's a John Denver song, Seasons of the Heart, which is one of my favorite songs. And it's the ultimate breakup song of all time. He wrote it for his, I think, his first wife, Annie, in their divorce. But he talks about, I come in love and I leave in love. And I never thought that I would feel most alone when I'm alone with you. It was so poignant for talking about this fantasy of who this person is and this love, and then find out they're not there.
Yeah.
That's killer. And we should do that before we get married and not later.
So really, learning to be alone with oneself and comfortable with oneself. And of course, you get to know yourself that way too. And there's definitely ways to do that in this society. And it's also, I think, more acceptable to do it if you think about it.
Well, a long-term relationship is a mirror. Is that this is a person who probably knows you better than anyone. They're maybe even know better than yourself, and they're reflecting back to you. And if you trust them, that reflection is going to hit home. And if you don't, you're going to make them bad. You're evil. You're saying bad things to me. And so a good relationship is just going to be a deeper, deeper mirror to see who we are. And there's profound healing in that, and also profound connection and the trust that comes out of that.
That's beautiful. I love that. And it does seem to take a certain kind of patience. And I guess there is a fine line between staying with something that is worth staying and leaving something that really can't move beyond a certain point. Because at least I know I have friends that went through a really tough time in a marriage, but they did it and they're happy together. And I could see where they could have split off. But what I understood from my friend is they both took responsibility for creating it. It wasn't like, the one did it and they both knew they'd played a part.
Takes two to make it work. And if they are willing to work, move on. I get all these letters and emails from women all the time who are in these relationships with men who were sexually abused as children. And the guys are just train wrecks. And these women are desperately trying to save them so they can be in a relationship. And I said, no, it's his job to save himself. And if he isn't willing to do that, then you need to move on because you're wasting your time. There's that old expression from the South that you can't teach a pig to sing. You frustrate you and you annoy the pig. A lot of truth in that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I've seen some of the opposite sometimes too. Like I remember I had a client who's fairly regular, and she had this new relationship, and she'd been in a bad relationship for many years before that, but she'd worked on herself. And this man treated her really well. Like he was a kind man, But he was not doing a spiritual path like her. And she had this idea that she was more spiritually evolved. And I remember just asking, I said, well, how do you feel about him? How does he treat you? Do you feel like it's different from your path? Oh, he's always wonderful and kind. I said, well, and does he stop you from your spiritual? Oh, no, he supports me in my spiritual path. He says, go ahead. And I just said, well, is there really anything wrong then? And that's not been the first time I've heard people that have had a decent connection with someone that's just not outwardly doing a spiritual path, but they are good people for them. So how do you address something like that? You know, where people are being maybe too literal about something.
Well, yeah, they're wanting their partner to be a reflection of them.
Yeah,
That's a narcissistic wound, and they're needing that partner to be the same to validate their path. And so they have to work on what's that really about? What child part of you is feeling unseen or not validated in some way, and it sounds like it's just their own stuff. They're needing that absolute mirror that we're doing the same thing, and two shall be as one crap. And so excuse me, there's a lot of people who are in these what I call mixed spiritual relationships. And where one is and one isn't. That's okay. It's only if the other one's denigrating or not supportive of their path, that's one thing. But if they're saying, this isn't really an interest of mine, but if it works for you, have a great time. And I'm sure I'll learn something from you along the way. That's as good as it gets. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're both deeply into this, great. But then people can get caught up in cults around that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, that's really true, actually.
And so it's really problematic. I mean, I just lost a dear friend. He had night terrors and sleptwalk and walked out of a window and died.
Oh my God.
He grew up in a really horrific cult where they were not allowed to have their own thoughts, and they literally were so intrusive. And so even though he came a long way, he hadn't got through enough of it that he had this accident at 26 years old, died.
Oh, that's really so horrible.
Yeah, it's really sad. But he was deeply, deeply wounded by growing up in this cult and this family that literally tried to force their thoughts onto him and how he should be thinking at every moment. And he was deeply, deeply wounded. It was just sad.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot more, I think, in our culture, because we can manipulate each other through thoughts. And again, that is maybe playing a role that hasn't been quite so prominent in terms of the way you can bully people on social media, to the extent you can bully people. It's really quite frightening, if you ask me. I feel especially for young people.
Yeah, because they don't understand. They're still trying to fit in, and they're still trying to belong. And that's what we want to do in our 20s and 30s. We want to be part of something. And it's not till we get to our 40s and 50s and like, not so much.
You can't wait to be with yourself, away from the groups.
Usually when people start discarding people in their life and say, yeah, these people aren't really interesting or useful to me, and they're taking more than I'm really okay. 50 is really the big turning point when people start really discarding people and things, and that's when the big change happens. But
that's the Chiron return.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. So it's fascinating, but youth is for the young, and I never understand people wanting to go back and do this again. I thought, you out of your mind? That wasn't really that fun.
I hear you. I totally agree with you. I can't. I mean, the amount of times I cried alone.
And the vapidness of so much of it. I mean,
I know the things you thought were really dramatic and important. So it's amazing any of us survive it.
Yeah, it's like this idealization of being carefree is like, it wasn't really that carefree, and it was a lot of anxiety. So anyway, it's so funny the things that people say and all these cliches that don't really have much grounding in reality.
Right. Now, if people want to reach you, is your website the best place to contact you for anything? And that is Merle Yost, MERLEYOST, for those of you listening. You also have an Instagram account too. Love Yost, again, the same
And
last name that you can at least, follow him on Instagram. But you do seem to have a lot on your website. Do you have anything upcoming in terms of workshops that you're planning on doing?
yeah, my unspoken boundaries workshops continue. I have 3 coming up in 10 days, actually. I think there's one the 19th, 21st, and 22nd. All have space available at the moment. It's a great way to really learn about boundaries and to stop absorbing your partner's or your friend's stuff so that you can be that profound observer instead of being lost in the wash of their emotions. I talk about, I always use the example of how many of you have ever gone to a friend to tell them something that was really upsetting you and had the friend fall apart and you end up taking care of the friend because they just absorbed all of your stuff and then they got swamped in that instead of being there for you, which is what you asked for in the first place. We teach you how not to do that in this workshop.
Well, I plan to do another one at some point because the first one really, it was one of the first workshops I've done in a long time period. And I did do the exercises afterwards for pretty much I've done it every day and miss a day now and then. And it was really did work in terms of I don't find there's still, I have some pockets where I feel I'm being pulled away from my thoughts. So that's why I wanted to go back. But as a whole, I noticed I wasn't having that happen as much. And I was so glad because I had tried like so many different techniques, and I guess you have to try and see what works. But I liked the in-person one because of the experience of the energies, and that was really surprising to me because I said I haven't done a workshop for so long, and I certainly think it can help a lot of people. It's helped me a lot, and I've continued to really I recommend it because it works. What you teach.
Thank you. Yeah, the now I just have the 2.5 hour online one. And it doesn't, unfortunately, I can't get into the practice that we could do in person. Mm-hmm. And people really got experience of this real time in the moment. But the new version of the workshop, which I certainly invite you to come take, is really, I finally think I've got it in terms of teaching in a way that people can really find accessible. They really get it. And the people have been really talking about how profound it's impacting their lives. So yeah, I'm really excited about where this is coming. I'm about to, hopefully soon we'll release the next level 2. And there's a lot going on. So
yeah, no, I think you've come up with something that can be helpful for so many kinds of people. That's the thing is sometimes you have these workshops you see and they're specialized for certain types of people. This is for everybody, anybody at any level of consciousness too, which I like is, you can, and I can see how it can deepen as you do more. As I said, I certainly have noticed it. And I'm always very, I got to make sure this works for me. And if it does, because sometimes there are techniques that just don't work that maybe do work for other people. But I think this is something that can work for a lot of people. So I will be back.
Well, thank you. The nice thing is that I've made it, I've tried to take the best of many traditions and combine it into something that's accessible, that doesn't require any tradition to use or specific tradition. And so whatever spirituality, whatever you're coming with, you can utilize your perspective from that, but use these tools within that and it'll work really, really well.
Yeah, that's what I got the impression too. It was like a distillation of what I know about what you've studied and gone through. And it was like a really powerful distillation, which, basically only happens when a person such as yourself has thought and worked with something for a while profoundly. And that's why, as the Buddhists will say, it takes a while to get wisdom, and because you had to go through all your experiences and the different trainings and try things, and you had luckily the patience to do it.
The time, the money, and the annoyance of willing to annoy other people.
That too. Well, thank you. We're coming to the end of our show, and thank you so much again for being on. I think this is going to help people a lot listening to it. So I know it always helps me, and people really enjoy it. But thank you for coming back, Merle.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a great joy. I'm just sad I wanted to come take you to lunch today, and so unfortunately we couldn't do that. So maybe next time.
Yeah, next time. We're close to the end of the whole pandemic. I can see the light, so we're pretty excited. And thank you all for watching today. We look forward to next week when we continue to explore the esoteric and the obscure together. Have a great week.